So thank you to the organisers, both for bringing us all together and for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Christine, whose presentation I think complements this to some extent, and who I have to say has been a real support to me at UCL Institute of Education. And that opportunity to have someone who can be supportive is so important when we're working in schools and in universities. I was in Birmingham 21 years ago. I lived here for a term when I did my final teaching practice. I'm establishing my local links and my credibility as a teacher there. And I was a primary school teacher up until last year. Now trying to finish my PhD, which is broadly in the philosophy of education and the critical philosophy of race. So George Yancey, who was just mentioned, is someone who I'm a massive fan of. And just a little advert bit, I also run the Hip Hop Ed seminar series, which is a sort of space that tries to have conversations like these. It's rather London-centric, just because we haven't got any money. But the next one is next Saturday. It's on original remix, tradition and innovation in creative practices. Everyone is welcome. Okay, let's crack on. The writer Carol Phillips, in his introduction to the 2005 edition of E.R. Braithwaite's To Sir With Love, urges us to read the book as more than mere historical curiosity. Quotes there. 50 years on, To Sir With Love can be read as a narrative of triumph over adversity. But clearly it's more than this. The author is keen for us to understand that the Ricky Braithwaites of this world cannot by themselves uproot prejudice, but they can point to its existence. And this, after all, is the beginning of change. One must first identify the location of the problem before one can set about addressing it. Okay, I'd like to highlight 2 points from this. The first, a thing I think of the day, the need for allies, and perhaps less emphasised, the need for collective action. The second, his stressing of the importance of identifying the location of the problem before one can tackle it. And I emphasise that in order to raise the question, although I don't think I'm necessarily the first to do this today, I wasn't sure how it was going to go. Is unconscious bias actually the location of the problem black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers face in education? I'd like to take this opportunity today to raise a number of ideas for consideration and signpost towards research areas that you might be interested in exploring some ideas a little further. I'm sure we all realise I can't go into everything and provide a detailed argument for each point. That's my excuse. But to some extent I've sacrificed depth for breadth, which I know is a cardinal sin in education, but it sometimes happens. I've done that, I think, with good justification, because I'm trying to open up a few avenues for further consideration, whether individually or collaboratively, and hoping to ensure we are appropriately attentive to ideas, some of which may be troubling or discomforting, but which I propose are also vital when we think about so-called BAME teachers in schools, unconscious and implicit bias, and the broader context in which I'm suggesting our conversations should take place. On the subject of discomfort, I'm interested in the notion of generative discomfort, and how I'm taken by Zeus Leonardo's expression that to have a comfortable conversation on race is somehow incongruous, given its power and the sheer havoc it has caused for us as a human species. Anyone who's interested in that, The Pedagogy of Discomfort by Megan Bowler. I'm not claiming that any of my ideas are original. I'm trying to be an academic after all. So, takeaway points. Number 1. When considering the status of teachers racialised as other than white, we should be very cautious of any intellectual framework that loses sight of the social, for reasons I'll lay out, or begin to lay out. Second, and related, we should exercise caution when working with a framework that seeks to understand ongoing inequalities and representation independently of knowledge. For knowledge, however we may describe it, is perhaps the core purpose of schools and indeed universities, where, at least at the moment, people learn to become teachers. Okay, with that said, in 2015, the then Chief of Ofsted, Sir Michael Wilshaw, praised head teachers who are battlers and bruisers and run a tight ship where chewing gum and swearing are also banned from the classroom. I'm not going to look at the chewing gum and swearing today. I'd like to zoom in instead on the phrase, run a tight ship, because I often hear it with regards to schools, and as I sense, it's growing in popularity. It positions head teachers as captains of the ship. Teachers, presumably, their crew. Students, perhaps as cargo on their learning journey towards destination life success. And Sir Michael, at this point, presumably the admiral of the fleet. Metaphors fascinate me for what they reveal, perhaps unconsciously, and perhaps I've stretched this one a little too far. However, I'd suggest that this particular nautical metaphor hints at a style of leadership that is strictly top-down and resistant to dialogue, to notions of distributed leadership, and to diversification of thought, and quite possibly people. We'll get to that. The prevalence of nautical metaphors in the English language grows out of the fact of Great Britain as an island, and the large role that sailing and the Navy has played in shaping Britain's identity, making its money, and indeed shaping the modern world. For whilst it was philosophers and scientists who developed theories and pseudo-theories of race, it was those who sailed off to far lands who provided the urgent need for intellectual justifications for the differential treatment of those whom they encountered. These nautical metaphors, to a greater or lesser extent, come out of Britain's colonial past. Our island story is in fact a global story. Even when not working in a school where the head teacher speaks of themselves as captain of the ship, teachers may find themselves being urged to pull together or to get on board with school policy or a new initiative. But right now, I'd like us to consider unconscious bias as part of a broader trend in academic work that permeates schooling. Namely, the psychological turn. This comes from Lorna Finlayson. A turn towards the science of the brain. The status of psychology as a science is not without controversy, and the corresponding turn away from the social realm. This is also going on in discussions of learning and education more broadly, with the trend, if you're on edgy Twitter, of cognitive psychology. What do we lose sight of when we focus exclusively on the psychological? So my claim is not that there's no value here. We move away from the social, the institutional, the structural, and the political. We're left thinking not about our society and our schools, but about ourselves, as individuals removed to some extent from our social context. This sense of working on ourselves is a trend that's pervasive. See, for example, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, I put that in inverted commas, I hope you can see one. Grit, resilience, and ultimately bias reduction. Now again, I'm not saying there's no value in any of these things, I'm just trying to highlight that when these are our focus, it's ourselves we work on. We leave the social realm as something not to think about and not to engage with. Many of these are in keeping with broader trends which we encourage to do with broader social issues by adjusting our lifestyle. Worried about climate change? Recycle your household waste. Worried about the economic exploitation of the global south? Buy fair trade. Worried about racism, or as I'd rather put it, the continuing legacy of colonial thinking that developed the process of racialization and shaped many of our institutions, including education? Reflect on your own biases. But unfortunately, this kind of New Age response, I'll put New Age in with a question mark, but you can't see that, to political issues puts the self centre stage. The I becomes invested in purging myself of certain traits, rather than acting upon the world. I make the mistake of thinking that my complicity in injustice begins and ends with what I purchase and what I think. Somewhat uncharitably, this has been described, as again on edgy Twitter I'm sure you've seen, as virtue signaling. A term I don't go along with, because most of the cases of using this term also seem to be examples of it. But with regard to racism, it does seem to rest on the notion of there being good and bad people, and with a suitable amount of work on myself, I can transcend racism. This also explains the huge sense of upset and anger often expressed by people, particularly people racialized as white, when racist consequences of their actions are brought to their attention. Within their protestations and accusations is an expression akin to, but I'm one of the good ones. And with regard to teachers racialized as other than white, the psychological turn can drive us towards remedies such as, I'm drying up, that wasn't a dramatic pause. Working on our confidence. Fake it till you make it. If you believe, you'll achieve. Or our courage. Be braver. Feel the fear and do it anyway. Again, not saying there's no value. I almost had a panic attack before I came on here now. I'm not saying that this stuff isn't important. But they have the unfortunate consequence of perpetuating deficit model thinking, because these solutions seem to locate the problem within the psychology of black, Asian and minority ethnic teachers. They implicitly answered the question, just what is it that BAME teachers are lacking that explains their underrepresentation at senior levels? I suggest this is a question we should avoid accepting uncritically, just as we should avoid uncritical acceptance of similar questions about particular cohorts of BAME children with regard to their attainment, with regard to school exclusion. Sarah Ahmed draws our attention to a further danger that seems pertinent here. The admissions of bad practice can come to be counted as signs of good practice. I.e., the mere process of documenting and acknowledging problems such as racism, sexism, underrepresentation, sexual harassment is taken as evidence that these problems are being dealt with. I've had this conversation with head teachers and with the head of education for a London borough. Going into acting mode here. How are you addressing racism in the school? We log all incidents of racism. How are you addressing the near absence of black head teachers in an area with one of the largest populations of black people in the country? We are documenting the numbers in this table. In Being White, Being Good, White Complicity, White Moral Responsibility and Social Justice Pedagogy, the philosopher Barbara Applebaum notes, one of the traditional concepts of moral responsibility is the presumption that moral innocence is attainable. Because such notions of responsibility centre the question, what can I do, rather than the question, what needs to be done, they can encourage moral solipsism, heroism, and white narcissism. Now, at this point, I was going to share a clip of Dr. Josephine Qualley, but there was a problem with the link. It's on YouTube. Qualley spelled K-H-W-A-L-I, and if you search unconscious bias, you can watch that video and find it. It's interesting, and I hope you are. I think the critique of implicit bias offered by feminist philosopher Lorna Finlayson in the context of feminism and academic philosophy can be helpful to our thinking about anti-racism in schooling. To talk about implicit bias is not to talk about and expose what I've called the ideology of patriarchy. It's not to confront a colleague about what they have said or done, about why what they've said or done is sexist. Implicit biases, according to the dominant conception, are a bit like sexually transmitted infections, or STIs. They're very common and nothing to be ashamed of. Sufferers are only deserving of condemnation if they refuse to get themselves checked and to take the necessary steps to protect those around them. The question of where implicit biases come from is rarely, if ever, posed. Perhaps, as with sexually transmitted diseases, it's thought better not to inquire. We might substitute patriarchy here for white domination, or as the philosopher Charles Mills argues, white supremacy. And we might substitute sexist for racist. There's value in destigmatizing STIs. There may be value in destigmatizing racist utterances, at least to the extent that it makes people able to have more reflective conversations about them without having to assert that their bones are not racist. But I think Finlayson is drawing our attention to both the potential loss of accountability and the loss of examination of causes. Hence, I urge extreme caution. Okay, Renietta Lodge, I was going to draw on here, her new book, which you might have heard, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Spoiler alert, she actually still is talking to white people about race. I know Rennie, because we were both in the Gooding book, so anyone who's put off by that, please don't be, please read the book. She talks here, this is on the BBC website, so you can search that again. Rennie uses the term denial. It's of the unconscious. This is explored by Stanley Cohen in his book, States of Denial. States of Denial, which looks at how nations collectively deny, distort, and engage in self-delusions, ironically, through the use of knowledge. Besides collective denials of the past, such as brutalities against indigenous peoples, people may be encouraged to act as if they don't know about the present. Whole societies are based on forms of cruelty, discrimination, repression, or exclusion which are known about, but never openly acknowledged. Indeed, distortions and self-delusions are most often synchronized. Whole societies have mentioned and unmentionable rules about what should not be openly talked about. You're subject to a rule about obeying these rules, but bound also by a meta rule, like a super injunction, which dictates that you deny your knowledge over the original rule. How does the era when Britannia ruled the waves shape curriculum? Dennis Lawton describes the curriculum as selections from a culture. What is selected? What is omitted and suppressed and repressed, only to rise up through popular idioms and metaphors? There's been a loud call for a greater focus on knowledge in schools. I suggest it's vital that those of us who care about social justice engage with this topic. Finlayson points out that too great a concern on representation, on increasing the number of women in academic philosophy, could have the effect of leaving structural injustices unchallenged. Again, we can, I think, translate that to BAME teachers in schools. If the curriculum is the map by which we navigate the learning journey, then it too deserves our attention, lest we be travelling toward a state of denial, albeit with a person racialised as black or Asian as chief of command. Now, we all have to make our own personal judgments as to how we relate to our principles and values and the place of compromise. But there may be ideas that we shouldn't get on board with. In fact, there may be times when we need to rock the boat, to challenge colleagues and our school leaders, when we're confident that there is a better path for the communities we serve. Now, this is not without risk, especially when we find ourselves isolated. Too many black, Asian, minority ethnic teachers feel they have no choice but to jump ship. Greater attention to the context in which they work, the culture of schools, and the knowledge that is presented within them is, I suggest, a vital shared project for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple minutes for any questions that you have for any of our speakers who we've just had. So we're taking questions from the audience again. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just off the, I love some of the conversations today around talking about the same old thing, and especially talking about the same old thing for the last 20 plus years. My kind of thinking, listening to the presentations now, and also thinking about the way forward for us, because again, a lot of teachers are leaving the profession. A lot of our young people feel that they're not connected to the education system as they ought to be. So I don't know if it's a question or not, but what are those things that we need to be doing, like when we go back to work on Monday, to put into place to make that difference? So even though it's pretty good to ask that question, what are those tangible steps?
Tangible steps we can use to move forward.
I would ask for an SLT. Beyond the work we do around race for Ofsted and reporting processes, what are we doing? What can we do differently? You know, who are we doing this for? And for what purpose? Because I think we've got, in schools, we've got to this point where we just do things because we're accountable to others for it. But I think, you know, we need to claim some of that back and actually move beyond sticking a box for Ofsted. Yeah, I mean, Ofsted's not going to go, but, you know, we can take ourselves beyond what Ofsted can do. Promote teaching to your young people.
Yeah, I think those are my two takeaway points. They're not straightforward and simple, but that's because racism is complicated. But I think clearly we need to resist anything that's too individualising, and we need to resist the idea that we talk about diversity over here and the debates around knowledge and the curriculum happen over here, as if those things aren't related. And I think it's our job to engage in those conversations, to join the dots. And as I said, the more that's a collective enterprise, the better it is for people not to be picked off in doing that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
It's not a question, it's kind of a response to Mark's
Yeah, go ahead.
the response that we've got. It's very difficult. I remember my SLT, when I've raised those issues, I've been shut down and alienated us. So we can't go back into our schools to do this. The head teachers that are here can go back and change it. But as a member of SLT, I've tried and have been completely shut down. But if there any way of getting, I know that it's a lot of money and it's obviously going to be to do with people sponsoring it, but getting some kind of leaflet out to every single school in the country. I know a leaflet might go in the bin. I know we put stuff on Twitter, but it's not as easy as just going into, in your position, you've probably got more scope to go into a school and question a head teacher. But even as a member of SLT, I can't even do it in my own school.
Take the NUT report in. Ask for it to be discussed at staff meeting.
But I think the NUT needs to, I can take that in and say, can we discuss it at staff meeting, but it can still be pushed aside. We need someone higher up than me. So it might have to be, I know, at some point, some MPs have to start doing it. People that are involved in that.
You've got to leverage the support from wherever you can get it.
But I think we need to step into those spaces where that work's going on, whether it's the NUT, whether it's NUT Black Teachers Group. I realise other unions are available, but that's the one I'm a member of. Whether it's the decolonising SOAS movement, I realise that again is rather niche, but there are plenty of campaigns that are looking at education, and I think it's joining into that and recognising those collective movements are important. I realise that when you're in the staff room, you know it doesn't have that immediacy that often people want, but I think we're in it for the long game.
Jazz?
I just want to respond to you as well, because I know you're awesome. I know that, one thing I know, and I did share in my workshop, is that revolutions never start at the top, ever. They start with people that have to account, they start with people who are care, who are passionate, and who never give up. So I know it's hard, but just you being in a place, for me at school, just makes such a difference for me as a student, just being in a place. And while we're waiting for the government and SLT and everyone else who's employed us and has more agency to get on and sort it out, we can live the change that we want to be. And yes, it means getting shot down, and yes, it means falling over, that's the commitment. But actually, at the end of the day, everybody does what they can do. Sometimes you need to get off and let someone else come fight for you because it's exhausting. But most of the time, revolutions start with us. We're the ones that make it work. So the more we look to someone else, the less we're doing it. And that's why this is so amazing, because this is everyone coming together, this is the first step. So I totally get where you're coming from, but I also know that waiting has never been that useful for me. So what's the revolution?
Okay, thanks. And there will be further discussion going on this afternoon when we have our panel up on the stage, and they'll be discussing how do we move beyond. Just a message that Dame Elizabeth will be here in the break to sign books, but we are going to now get you off to your second workshop. Woo!